Hello? Why can't I see myself? Everything inverted on the screen? Is the camera backwards? What? It's hard to read. No, it's not that. This is weird. Uh, shit's- Yes. No. That's what I'm doing. Wait, it's not upside down up there? That is bizarre. Well, maybe we'll just a little slower, but we might just watch from the YouTube page. You guys have this anyway. I figure this out. There we go. All right, good morning, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me online. If you can, feel free to send me a Zoom message if anyone's watching, or a clap or something. Oh, looks like no one has joined us virtually. So I'll wait a few minutes and see if anyone joins. And if no one does, I'll just drop this thing. Yes, Bob. Yep. So I'm not going to test you over something that's only in the book, that's not discussed in class. But the book is a great resource, and I think it'll help you understand the material. And there's some in the book that you won't be tested on. And that's going to be things, like I said, the neuroeconomics and a few other details. And there's some models that are more detailed than we go into that are in the book. Yeah. 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 Especially as we get to the other chapters, it'll be a little closer, but we're gonna be more focused in the book, because the book is gonna go through more stuff than we do. And sometimes I'll briefly talk about some of the stuff in the book, but not in as much detail as they do. Go off the lecture notes. Yes. But the presentation stuff can be on the test. So keep that in mind. That's the papers people present on. Yes. Yes. But I encourage you to at least, skim most of it. But it's a good book. So if you can, read it. I'm still the only one in this meeting. Or actually, no, it's a live YouTube, so I don't know. I'll have to check. Let me see. Send me a YouTube message if you're watching this. Oh, there are two. There are a couple of people watching. So, okay. All right, our first homework for the class is due on Wednesday. I didn't write on the board. I didn't have as much time. I apologize for the climate or the weather. There's nothing I can do about it. There. All right, so I think last class we stopped right here. Is that correct? We went through these 4 items. We didn't go through all 4. Did we stop maybe at 3? I think. I keep hearing an echo in my ear. That's why I'm pausing. I'm gonna try and silence that. Let's try it now. Okay, hopefully that's the last digital hiccup, and this is why I don't do this all the time, because there's always hiccups. All right, so we discuss, we'll discuss next chapter 3. People might not maximize utility. They might do other things. In fact, we'll briefly talk about it a little bit today. And the traditional model doesn't account for things such as loss aversion, which we'll also talk about next week. People clearly don't update briefs properly. I talked to you about the Monty Hall game. Most of you said you would not switch doors, even though switching doors is the best thing to do. And there are many more complex situations than that regarding probability that people go through in their everyday life. And the fact that we can't do it with the Monty Hall game should tell us that we're just not very good at it. And in fact, later in the course, I'm going to talk to you about a doctor who basically got a woman thrown in prison on the charge of murdering her 2 children when she's probably was innocent, because he didn't understand basic probability. Are people expected utility maximizers? Well, that activity earlier, remember when I said $1 million for certainty versus $10 million 50% of the time, and then $1 million 2% of the time, and $10 million 1% of the time? Most of you switched from the 1 million to the 10 million, but if you did that, that's not consistent with being an expected utility maximizer, which is a lot of the traditional economic models assume. So there's some problem with the way traditional economic models handle risk. And do people discount consistently over time? I think that's a clear no. People have something called present bias, which has been introduced into the economic literature over the past decade or two, and that we treat the now very differently than we treat any other time period. And for that reason, there's some cool programs that take advantage of this, such as Save More Tomorrow, which one group will be presenting on. Speaking of which, hopefully all of you have looked at those papers. So don't forget, this Friday, we're going to choose our groups. On Wednesday, I plan to give you a little bit of time to meet around with other people in class to see if they have the same interest in you. And Friday, we will choose the papers to present on. Okay. Friday will also be, I believe, our first quiz, if I'm not mistaken, on this set of lecture notes. So what is the basis of behavioral economics? Well, the goal of any individual, including a human, is to pass on genes, right? So if you look at biology, this is how we tend to think about the goal of species. And maybe that's not quite as true today, but at least it was probably initially true that the goal of humans was to pass on genes. And the most successful individuals are those who successfully reproduce and nurture offspring and pass on genes at a higher rate than unsuccessful individuals. But evolution often takes time, right? So evolution is not just, we didn't go from monkey to man in one iteration. And many features that were once an asset, for example, we all probably love ice cream or cheesecake or things that are very fatty, steak, etc. Those were once a huge asset, right? Because there was a shortage of calories around the globe. But now, of course, that's a bad thing. We have this huge problem with obesity. And so now that's actually detrimental. And decision-making skills often use heuristics. So what is a heuristic? A heuristic is a mental shortcut. And I'll just write that down now. So we don't waste resources on a problem, right? So there's something called cognitive load theory, right? It takes you a long time to think about what the optimal decision is. And if it takes you so long to do that, well, think about the opportunity cost of that time. You could be doing something else. So instead of finding the optimal solution, one thing that humans do is they use heuristics. So an example is if you ever watched any of those auction shows like Storage Wars, oftentimes they don't think about strategy. They just say, I'm going to bid half the value of the object. So I think it's worth $10,000, so I'm going to bid up to $5,000 on that object. There's nothing to say that that's the optimal thing to do. It could be, but it's probably not, right? In fact, if you've taken game theory or an advanced game theory course, there's very complex differential equations you have to solve to figure out what is the optimal bidding strategy in an auction. And a lot of firms that are really big hire economists to do that. But the bidders in storage war aren't multi-million-dollar or multi-billion-dollar corporations, right? They're people who don't make a lot of money. They don't hire economists to do this, so they just use a heuristic. And one thing you'll often hear is they'll bid half the value of an object at an auction. Maybe instead of thinking about how much utility per dollar you get from cereal, you're just attracted to the cereal with the prettiest box. And so that's why you buy it, not because it's going to be the one that gives you the most satisfaction, right? That's a shortcut. If you took a macroeconomic class and you learned about consumption smoothing, where people should try to have the same amount of consumption over a lifetime, then it would be very hard to figure out, well, if I'm going to make this much when I'm 60, this much when I'm 50, this much when I'm 40, how much should I spend today to be able to consumption smooth throughout my lifetime? And it probably would vary among person. Well, people don't spend a lot of time calculating. They use heuristics. They'll do something like, oh, I'm going to save 10% of my paycheck, right? I'm not going to save more or less. I'm just going to save 10% because that's a simple thing to do, right? So people use heuristics all the time. And I have a great heuristic. So for those of you who are on virtually, which I think is just one or two of you, go to my Blackboard page and go to the first lecture. I'm going to show you a video about a great heuristic that'll help you on Valentine's Day, because it's coming up, and I know a lot of you might have some dates. Can you hear it? Oh. I can hear it. Can you hear it? There's no sound? Let me unplug this for a minute. Hopefully people can hear me. All right, so economic theory, if you've taken microeconomic theory, intermediate micro in particular, or advanced micro, which probably none of you have, and that's okay. But if you take more economic theory classes beyond the principles course, really the better way to think about it, instead of predicting what we do, sometimes it does, but more often it tells us what we could and should do, right? How we should behave, how much we should save, how much we should consume, etc. While behavioral economic theory tells us what we could and would do, how we actually behave. So, standard economic theory has homo economist, a super selfish individual who's perfectly rational and who can make complex calculations and is an expected utility maximizer. It's a useful model sometimes, but it often has its shortcomings, and that's really what we're going to cover in this course. So how do we test theory? And I'm going to cross some of these out. I'll tell you why in a little bit. Well, the first way to test theory, and this is sort of the most common for a long time in economics, is something called a natural experiment. So this is conducted through a naturally policy change of the government, firm, etc. And then we collect the data and analyze it. So what's great about this, so an example is there's a famous study on the minimum wage. The minimum wage went up in New Jersey, but not in Pennsylvania. Most of you are aware that New Jersey borders Pennsylvania. And so what they wanted to see was, well, was the change in employment over the following year or multiple years different in New Jersey, which had a higher minimum wage, than in Pennsylvania, which had a lower minimum wage? That's a natural experiment. I mean, that's not, the government didn't do this to test the economic theory. They did it for policy-wise, but economists analyzed this data to see if the minimum wage did affect unemployment. And what's great about this is sometimes the data is really cheap, right? So for example, unemployment statistics, you can usually get from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. And we can have other people look at the same data and just reproduce the same results, right? They could run the same statistical analysis as we do, and it's easy to replicate in that sense. And so it's kind of hard to quote unquote cheat using data that's externally given. But it's not really perfect. And the biggest is there's not control over the variables in the field experiment, or I should say natural experiment, sorry, causing strong assumptions or weak results. So some of you have taken econometrics, and there's the basic ordinary least squared model, which sometimes is good, but you have lots of problems where it's not the change in policy that actually caused maybe unemployment to change, but maybe it was something else that caused unemployment to change. Maybe New Jersey gave a tax cut that year. Maybe Pennsylvania did something different, right? So something else could have happened to affect the unemployment rate in either New Jersey or Pennsylvania. And we try to do with all the statistics we can, we try to do our best to control for that. But ultimately, we can't. We can't, right? There's not, the person analyzing the data has no control over what's happening. And of course, since you're not coming up with the data, you have to trust that whoever is giving you the data is doing a good job. Now with the Fred, I think that's a good case. But if you borrow a data set, for example, from a private company, you might question whether they would give you a data set if it wasn't a good one and didn't make them look favorably. And you just might question the accuracy. So the natural experiment was the way, outside of traditional just theory, that economists typically looked at evaluating economics. Well, another type of experiment is something I call a natural field experiment. And this is where there's some control, and you perform an experiment in a natural environment without the knowledge of the subject, right? So the subject doesn't know you're actually studying them. It could be an observation study, or you could be actively doing something. There are studies where there's an actor, for example, who actively does things, but the subject does not know they are being studied. And what's great about this is the experiment occurs in a natural environment. So if we compare that to something like if we ran an experiment here on the computers, that's, for most cases, that's not a very natural environment. Now, if we're testing maybe education, it's a natural environment. But if we're testing anything outside of education in this room, it's not a natural environment, right? If I had you play a game, for example, on charity giving, I bet you all of you would look more generous in this room on the computer than you would out on the streets. So what's great about a natural field experiment is it has more external validity in the sense that they're actually out in the environment. And since they don't know they're being studied, because when people know they're being studied, they behave differently, we don't have that concern. Now, we don't have as many control on the variables as we do when we're in the computer classroom, for example. So that's a downside. But the bigger downside is there are ethical concerns with involuntary participation, particularly when you're making some people worse off, right, than they would be if they weren't in the study at all. And obviously, there have been horrible atrocities that have happened where people have been involuntarily part of experiments. And if you work in academia, anytime you do anything with humans, you have to get something called IRB approval. So the university actually has to approve of your study. And it's going to be a harder hurdle to jump if your subjects don't know they're participating. Okay. There's also something called a frame field experiment, where we perform an experiment in a natural environment with the knowledge of the subjects. So for example, we could have there's a theory on how people should serve in tennis, or how people should kick in penalty kicks using game theory. And if we hired a bunch of soccer pros and I took them down to the field and I had them do penalty kicks against the goalie, and I'm testing my model to see if people play the way my model says they do, they're in a study, right? They're not on the field playing a game. They know they're in a study, but it's still a field experiment because I'm actually using professionals in their environment. Okay. And then finally, there's also something called sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we don't have as control on as many of the variables, all right, still as in a classroom. And sometimes they're expensive if you have to pay the professionals a lot. We also have laboratory field experiments. So this is where you use non-standard subjects in an experimental laboratory. So there's two types of standard subjects. The most standard historically has been students, undergraduate students. Anyone know why economists typically use students? Is it because students represent the entire population? No, they don't actually. That's a criticism of it. Then why? Yeah, they're available, and that's half of the reason. The other half is they're cheap. It's a lot easier to pay a student to do something than an investment banker or a lawyer or a doctor. But a laboratory field experiment, you are using those non-standard actors. And so some of you will present papers on this. An example is bringing day traders in. Let's say we brought in investment bankers from New York, and we wanted to see how well they traded assets in an experimental economics laboratory. Do they fall prey to the same fallacies as we observe in undergraduate students? Or do they not? They're doing this every day. They're more familiar with trading assets. So maybe they're better at it than the undergraduate students are. Now, this is a very artificial environment. In the case of day trading, maybe not so much. But what if I brought in soccer players and then I had them play a penalty kick game on a computer? It's not the same as actually kicking the ball, right? It feels much more artificial. But it comes with a benefit in this, that we have so much control over the environment. So think about day trading. We can set the parameters, right? We as the experimenter know how the asset is going to behave, and even if the subjects don't, right? Or we know on average how it's going to behave, at least, even if there's some randomization in our code. And these individuals can be expensive, and it can be hard to recruit. So a lot of times the people who do these studies are people at really big R1 institutions, because you're flying people in. Maybe not so much anymore. Now you can do it just virtually, but even then it's still expensive because you have to pay quite a bit more. And then there's a laboratory experiment, which I've done some here. My colleague Benjamin Baranek has joined me, and we do run some here. We'll probably run some more next year. This is an experiment that uses students or Mechanical Turk. Is anyone familiar with Mechanical Turk? So this is an online program where people participate in experiments. And so this could be people who are, in fact, some studies say that it's better to use it, others say not. But the advantage of Mechanical Turk is you have a more diverse, particularly in regards to the age population. So these are people who are just playing economic games online, and they sign up, and then if they're there and the experimenter starts a study, they do it. It doesn't pay very well, and that's one thing that's been critiqued about. It pays worse. They earn less than, for example, students in the laboratory. But one advantage is you get a different subject pool. Now, that doesn't mean that subject pool represents the general population either, right? Someone who has more free time at home to play a game on the internet is going to be very different from someone who's busy all the time, for example. So it's not like it's perfectly representation, but it's good to maybe get a different group. And it depends on what you're studying. If you're looking, for example, the effect of age on something, doing something at the university is probably not the best place to do the study because almost everyone here is between 18 and 26. Not everyone, but most of you. So we have lots of control over the environment. These are pretty inexpensive studies. You might say, well, it's going to be a couple $1,000s or maybe $10,000 even if it's a really big study. But some of these other studies can be a lot more than that. It's very artificial. So to me, personally, the external validity is going to depend on what you're studying. So education or trading assets. The environment in the lab is very similar to how you do it in real life, right? If you're, maybe it's not quite the same because it's going to be on your transcript if you take a test in the classroom, whereas if you take a test in a lab, you earn money instead of getting a grade. So it's not exactly the same, but it's much more similar than the situation where you're on the street and someone asks you for money, right? When the screen tells you, would you like to donate $10 to the homeless fund or something? And so depending on what you're studying, the external validity is going to vary. Now you might say, well, which of these is the best way to study? And a lot of people have, there's been critiques of experimental economics, particularly the fact that it's undergraduate students. I think early on in the Obama administration, one of the economists was talking about studies, and one of the policymakers said, these are undergraduate students. What can that tell us about economics? I think it can tell us some. And you can, by the way, you can do these together, right? So you can do a lab experiment to test a theory, and if the behavior in the lab is consistent with that theory, then you might want to spend more money or more time and look at one of these other systems. So it's not like one is better than the other. You can do all of them. Yes. I think that's a good way to do it, but not always. I mean, like I said, when you're actually testing education theories, they are the population of interest, right? But let's say we're testing auction theory. Well, a lot of auctions now are done online, so I think there still is a lot of external validity there. Do most people who work in businesses in the procurement industry, did they go to a university? I would say yes. And so I think that would have maybe not as much external validity as the education, but I think I would trust that study more than one on, for example, charity, right? But yeah, something on charity, the lab might be a good place to start, but we might be hesitant. This is just my personal, I'd be hesitant to necessarily fully believe that until I saw that result replicated out in the field. Not everyone feels that way. Some people might think the experiment is enough, and some people don't really care for experimental economics. I think that's changed now. Experimental economics is mainstream. At one point, it wasn't. There was a foundation run by Vernon Smith, a Nobel Prize winner, that actually just shut down. That used to not because it had to, but just because it's been so successful. That most universities, including ours, we just offered it for the first time this past fall, offer an experimental economics course. And part of the goal of this foundation was to bring in undergraduates to teach them experimental economics, because many institutions in the 90s and early 2000s didn't have it. And so after 25 years, the institution just shut down, which I think was just two years ago it shut down. So all these, in my opinion, are a good way to test theory. One isn't necessarily better than the other. And it might just depend on what you're studying. So they're all good ways to test theory. You need to know all of them, and you need to know some of the downsides and positive upsides to each of them. One thing we're not going to talk about a lot in economics is it's a newer subject. It's not as sorry, let me take a step back. Forgot to say something. I mentioned it, but I want to focus on it. Something done in the lab, it's not clear if you get it in the lab, if it's just because they're students or because they're not students. So I think I mentioned that, but I just want to highlight it again. So near economics is when you give a brain scan to subjects. Some of the older studies might have a picture of cheesecake or money, and you can see how that affects, how people's brains are highlighted. The only one we're really going to focus on in this class is with loss aversion. it turns out there is biological evidence that people are loss averse. So our brains have different activity when we get money than when we lose money. Okay, so there actually is evidence using neuroeconomics that loss aversion is a real thing. We're not going to talk much about neuroeconomics. I'm not including that in the studies. Those are the most expensive studies because you need an MRI machine to do it. And they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to just maybe purchase, and then just to operate them is still expensive. So very few universities have this, but it's a new field. We're actually seeing how biology interacts with economics, and it's one of the foundations for behavioral economics, including this idea of loss aversion. Now, with all of those studies, if you ever do a study, there's going to be two types. So let's say we're doing a study in this classroom. There's a within subject design and a between subject design. In a within subject design, the same subject is both in the treatment and control group. So I do a study, maybe I see how well you bid in a particular type of auction. And then I do a different type of auction and I see if people bid more according to theory in one type of auction versus the other type of auction, but the same subject is participating in both the treatment and the control. A between subject design is subjects are in the control or treatment, but not both. So medical studies have to be this way, right? You can't give someone a placebo and then the drug, right? Medical studies have to be this way. And there's some studies that just have to be this way. For those who took game theory, you learned about the game of 21, right? And you could figure out the game of 21 just by virtue of playing it. And once you learn it, you can't really unlearn it, if that makes sense. So once you learn something, you can't unlearn it. So you might have to have a between subject design for something like that as well. But there are some cases where you actually have to have a between subject design. People can't be in both. Like I said, the obvious example is in medicine. We have a placebo, a control group, which gets a placebo. And then we have another group, which actually gets the medication. Okay. Any questions about a within and between subject design? Is it pretty obvious what the difference is? So I'm going to just one more thing. Within subject design, let's say you're all doing a study with me. You'll all participate in every part of the study. Sometimes with the within, you'll switch it if there's two parts. Sometimes half the group will do one part first and the other part second. The other part will do the other part first and the other part second. Not always, but sometimes. A between subject design, I'd take maybe everyone on the right side of the room. It's my right, but the right side of the room would do one study, and the left side of the room would one would be the control group and the other would be the treatment group. Okay. So which one's better? It just depends on what you're doing. So with medical, between you have to, but it just depends what you're studying. I want to talk about two other topics with the lab. The first is deception. In economics, we do not use, or we rarely use, it's not very condoned in the field of economics, deception. Years ago, when I was a graduate student, there was an interdisciplinary research group that met, and we were talking about experiments, and someone was talking about the particular design of an experiment, and the sociologist raised her hand, and she said, why don't you just tell the subject that it's another person playing when it's just a computer? And we said, we don't do that in economics. We don't do deception. We are honest with our subjects. And you might think, oh, economists are more ethical people. Perhaps, but that's not why. There is an ethical argument for it. I'm not saying that there's not, but why do economists care about a deception if it's not with ethics? Beg your pardon? Not legal. Psychologists did it for years. I think it's kind of changed in psychology. Psychologists used to just lie to their subjects all the time. In fact, there's an old Modern Family where they think the psychologists are lying to them. They're in a waiting room and there's a switch that says, do not touch this switch. And they think that's part of the study because, psychologists trick people all the time. And so they're debating the whole episode whether to hit the switch. Then finally one hits the switch and the psychologist comes in and says, we're ready for the study. They thought, oh, I thought this was a study. It was whether we hit that switch or not. He said, no, you just shut off the air conditioning for 3 hours. Now we have to wait till it kicks back on. So in economics, we don't do that. And it's more practical. We want the subjects to believe what we tell them. Okay, we want the subjects to believe what we tell them. So we certainly don't directly deceive. It's very rare, particularly in the lab. There are a few exceptions. So in the lab, sometimes you're not necessarily given the full information, but you typically are. But once in a while, there might be just something you don't know about, but you're not lied to directly. Does that make sense? You might call it a lie by omission if you want, but you're certainly not lied to directly. And in the field experiments, sometimes deception really is necessary if you're doing something with the consent of the subject. So an example are studies on racism or sexism. So if you tell the subject, we're doing a study on sexism, or we're doing a study on racism, do you think that's going to change how they behave in the experiment? Yes. So studies on these very sensitive topics might have some deception, typically in the field. But it's very looked down upon. And in fact, a lot of journals in economics won't publish your work if you use deception. Other journals, they say if you use deception, you have to write a document stating why deception was necessary and why you had to use it. And so an example of that would be one of those types of studies. And there have been various studies that have done that. They've had people go to car dealerships of different races and see if the offers are different, for example. They've had men and women get different taxi quotes and see if the offers are different. In fact, when I talk about referee reports, that's a paper I wrote a referee report on when I was just a little bit older than you. So in economics, deception is a no-no. Yes, it's ethically wrong. According to many, in my opinion, it's ethically wrong to deceive people if you don't have to, but that's not the main reason experimental economists don't do it. The main reason is practical. We want our subjects to trust us. Financial incentives. Who here has taken a psychology class? Raise your hand. Just a couple of you. Did you have to do an experiment as part of that class sometimes? That was a requirement, right? You were actually forced to go. Did you get paid for that study? No. So in economics, it's very different. One, attendance is voluntary. And two, you are financially compensated for your decisions. So I think the voluntary aspect is just a philosophical thing, right? Economists are just more market oriented and they're more about voluntary transactions. And there's also this aspect, if someone really doesn't want to be there, what is the value of studying their decision making, right? Because in most cases, if someone doesn't want to be in a situation, they can often just, not all, but in many, they can often just leave. But why do economists pay subjects? Why don't we just bring them in? Why do we pay them? One is to get them to come, but besides that, we could just give you $20, but we actually often pay you for your performance. Why is that? Yes. Right. So if let's say you're trading assets, right? So there's asset A and asset B. If I'm not paying you, you just might click the button as fast as you can to get the hell out of here, right? But if I pay you for how well you trade, you're probably going to take it more seriously because if you do a better job trading, you're going to earn more money. And there have been studies that compare non-incentivized experiments to incentivize, and subjects generally do take incentivized experiments more seriously. So in economics, we don't use deception, and we usually use financial incentives in our studies when they're in the lab or if they're in the field with the subject's consent. Any questions on either of those? The last topic of these notes is to think about ways to evaluate theory. And there's 6 ways to do it. The first is congruence with reality. Does the theory actually seem like it's consistent with reality? So if I just say people behave randomly, that's probably not congruent with reality. We know people don't just behave randomly. So the first way is what people do, is my model actually congruent with what actually happens? All right, so that kind of is exactly how it sounds. All these other ones, I'll give you a little more formal of a definition. Another way we state whether a theory is good is something called generality. So what does generality mean? It means we can apply the model in many places. So what does that mean? Well, I might have a perfect model that's congruent with reality, that models exactly how you behave at the casino at 3 a.m. after 6 drinks in Las Vegas at Caesar's Palace. It might be great in every aspect, but that is not a general model, right? That's a very specific model. I might have another model that just says how you behave in scenarios that involve risk. That's a very general model, right? It doesn't cover it. There are scenarios without risk, but that's a very general model because it covers any case where it has risk. Right? So we like models that are more general, right? Because we can use them more often. It's not saying that specific models aren't good, but general models, we can apply them in many places. That's a nice thing to do. The law of demand is a very general model, right? That applies all over the place. We also like tractable models. Tractable, informally, you can think of that means the model is clean. It's not messy. So if you've taken econometrics, again, not a requirement for this course, but the way you first learn to run regressions is using something called ordinary least squares. It's a linear model. A linear model is very clean, and it's easy to work with. Typically, a tractable model is going to have fewer variables, not necessarily. You could have a linear model with lots of variables, and you could have a nonlinear model with a few variables, and the nonlinear model could be more complex. But ceteris paribus, more variables means it's going to be less tractable. But tractable is nice. It's easier to work with using software. It's easier for people to understand when it's a simple model, right? And that's an important aspect as well. So we like tractable models. The next one is parsimony. Has anyone heard the term Occam's razor? What does Occam's razor mean? For those of you who heard it, does anyone remember it? Yes. Good. Simple is better. So ceteris paribus, if we have 2 competing models, we prefer the simpler one. All right. Typically, a simpler model is going to be more tractable, but not necessarily. Precision. Now, for some people, this is ultimately the purpose of the model. It's not always the only purpose of the model, but it's often the purpose of a model is to make predictions, right? So how well does the model predict? Maybe I have a nonlinear model with 1,000 variables that's extremely complicated. So it's that predicts the stock price of I don't know, soda stocks, right? It's a very specific model. So it's not a general model. It's not tractable. It's not parsimonious, but it's very precise. So it's good in that aspect, but it's bad with everything else. And the final way that we judge a model is psychological plausibility. This is something that economists actually usually ignored and often still do, right? Remember we talked about as-if models at the start of this course. Economists say, well, it doesn't matter if it's rooted in a psychological process. If people behave as if, who actually cares? In behavioral economics, we prefer, when possible, we prefer models rooted in a psychological or biological process. So loss aversion is rooted in the psychological process. We already talked about that, where people's brains behave differently with losses and gains. Traditional economics did not have loss aversion. Later in the class, when we talk about intertemporal choice, those are choices made over time. We are actually going to work with a behavioral model that's an as-if model, but I'll talk about other models that use a psychological process. And you might say, well, why don't we use those other models? Because it doesn't score well on some of these other ones. In fact, it's really tractability. Like I said, it's hard to teach people models that aren't very tractable. Any questions on different ways we're going to evaluate economic theories? Yes, Bob. So most of the papers you're doing are empirical papers. In fact, I think I got rid of all the theory papers. A lot of them are testing a theory, but the authors aren't creating the theory. So if this were a behavioral economic theory class where all we did was theory and I showed you some theory papers, this would be great. But because all of them are either using data or experiments or field experiments, I'm not saying you can't use this, but it's not going to be like your roadmap, if that makes sense. One other thing I want to say about these is these are often kind of in tension with one another. So again, if something is simple, it's probably going to be tractable, but it's probably going to be less precise, right? In fact, if you've taken econometrics, always if you add another variable, your model by definition becomes more precise. And if we want a model to be more general, that could go either way. Sometimes adding more variables makes it more general. Sometimes taking away variables makes it more general. But models that are more psychologically plausible tend to be less tractable, right? And that's why economists often didn't use them. They're often hard to work with. I had a former colleague who's now at Tennessee. He was a few years older than me as a graduate student. And he hated working with behavioral game theory models sometimes because they're just so much harder to work with than traditional economic models because they're not as tractable. Not always, but that's usually the case. All right, any last questions on this? All right, next class, we are going to do an actual in-class experiment. We'll talk about some of Vernon Smith's original experiments that he ran in the 60s, way back in the day. And Vernon Smith is in his 90s. I saw him do a presentation last year or a year and a half ago. I mean, that is pretty amazing that someone in their 90s is giving presentations to hundreds of people. So we'll talk about him, and I'll also give you some time to I can answer any questions. Look at the homework. It's due Wednesday. If anyone has a quick question, I can answer questions on the homework. And then the last 10 minutes or so, maybe 15 of class, I'll let you meet around with each other to figure out which paper or which group members you want to work with for your presentations. Homework is due 11:59 on Wednesday. All homework is always due at 11:59. Any other questions? Yeah, experimenter effect is you're being watched, so you behave differently. So I mentioned that. I don't know if I said that's what it was, but yeah, when you know you're being watched, you behave differently. That's called an experimenter effect. Good question. All right, I'll see you on Wednesday. Hopefully the weather is a little more cooperative.